Rush for Glory. This is let's lead with the summation. This is a really innovative design in a lot of ways for an operational type situation. It seems to cover the material reasonably well. I got my little gripes about it. But it does seem to largely work. But that innovation kind of falls flat on its face for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is the subject matter itself. And the subject matter is probably part of why the design is what it is, in terms of this real emphasis on the attrition that takes place. And that's fine. The problem is, to make the Mexican-American War interesting is a hard job. I think Halls of Montezuma kind of came close. It had a lot of its own flaws. But the CDG format allows you some capability for more random events type stuff. And there are other ways to add that in. And that's really kind of the only way to make it a terribly interesting game or a situation to game. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe not. That is a way to try to make it more interesting. Because the truth of the matter is, the war itself is almost a foregone conclusion. So this game makes it something of a race. Can you beat the historical equivalent situation? But that feels a little insufficient when you're looking at, something that really is the whole war. Yes, it's an operational scope, but that's because the war is fairly quick, And it's kind of the bigger operational, very abstracted. Another thing that really went wrong with this one is, I think, the component selection that, the 3W magazine format allowed. Not a lot of counters, not a lot of extraneous sheets, etc. The map is small, very small, even for 3W. Some extra paper on here and some tracking spaces might have worked well. Instead, you're keeping track of everything on pieces of paper that are both difficult. They require a whole lot of erasing and rewriting all over the place. And even as pieces of paper, they're maybe not set up in the most efficacious manner. They could have been designed better, not putting the leader names on the stacks, instead allowing the leader to be one of the many variables that you coordinate, because moving the leader sometimes is the most easy functionality. But more than that, I think that something that tracked using counters on tracks a la the Zucker designs would probably reduce the burden quite a bit from this erasing and rewriting and all kind of crap like that. It would take a fair number of counters, though, to do right, and I can understand the choice, but the particular choice may have been enough to damn the system. Another thing that is kind of damning for the game is that the rules weigh in at 8 pages, about, 8 pages of rules. You get rid of the cover of the back end. That's what you got here. 8 pages, and wait a minute, one of them, hold on, let's reduce that. Not 8 pages of rules. It looks to me, take 2 more pages out of there. So we're down to 6 pages of rules. That is tiny. I mean, we're talking about things like the blue and gray quad get away with that, where most of this is boilerplate and has already been condensed pretty tightly, and is intended for people who already understand that kind of war game. This is a completely new system, and so what happened was you had incredibly sketchy rules. They leave some ambiguities, but more importantly, it's a hard way to approach this very different type of game. It really doesn't hold your hand. In fact, it goes the opposite way. There are things where the rules aren't there. The only way you find it is in an example, essentially, that shows you kind of what the rules may intend to state. They don't actually state the rules as rules in some cases. And again, that's let's get this as small as possible. And of course, not only do we have this inset that's 2 pages of paper that's saved from the map, right? This map is tiny, but then within that, you got your normal, 3W tended to do this, I guess. They got the Charlies and a feedback questionnaire inserted into the rule book, which I'm not a big fan of, but I guess it's better than advertising. I don't know. Same shit. Sometimes they stick the ads right in there. 3W was not the height of the S&T period. It was the nadir. But that said, this is actually an interesting design. So what's interesting about it? Well, let's talk about some of the components to begin with that I haven't already spoken of. So there are too few counters to handle, not to handle the game itself. The way the game is written, there are enough. There are these icky glossy counters on kind of a glossy map. I hate that, but whatever. That's the period. You get used to it. The map itself is small. Some people have called it really hideous. I don't think it's that bad looking. I think, though, the fact that this is a terrain type that's different from this, and that's really hard to see, and that this, I think, no, this is another terrain type, a third one. Those are simply not differentiated well enough. There's some errors on the map, numbering error that isn't that big a deal, but they forgot to put the months in here, or they got dropped, whatever. Yeah, there's significant amounts of sort of production issues that went into this, and again, that's standard for 3W, I think. They really kind of schlopped things out the door. There's 3 developers, 2 of which are further designers. So this thing underwent some kind of redesign. There were playtesters. I can't imagine that this went through a blind testing and that was at all rigorous and came back with, yeah, this is all good. But who knows, some games get play tested, the play testers say, wow, they really could use some rules for this. And development decides, screw that, man. We got to get this out the door or whatever. But yeah. Oh, here's some ads. Yay. But yeah, I mean, almost no counters at all, right? Jesus. Tiny game. What about the way the game plays? Well, there's not a whole hell of a lot, but what there is very different. So first you have this supply phase, which is very loose, but it's basically your big armies have to be within 3 spaces of a depot, and you can chain your depots, kind of like in Empire's, Arms and some other games that are similar. It's an area game, essentially. It's a bubble map instead of areas, but whatever. Reinforcements, all fixed on the game, poorly described. Basically, they're just kind of badly formatted, thrown into the rules like this. Not a pleasant way to see them, but okay. Nothing exciting yet. Now we go to the movement phase, and this is where the game gets exciting. First of all, there's a little bit of Chrome, some die rolls for, hey, can you do this? Can you do that? Which again, that's kind of the event system, but it's so sparse in this that it isn't going to heavily impact play. What I found is even with sort of the latest U.S. invasion turn coming up and everything, you can still win the game by the end of the game. So, that's not going to be something that forces you to really do anything too clever and exciting. And I don't know how much clever and exciting stuff there is in the game to do. It did feel like the advantages the U.S. has in combat are such that with the attrition moves and everything being so harsh, especially on the Mexicans, and the quality of their troops being so crappy, that there's not a lot that can stop the U.S. from just sort of slowly plotting and taking the things they want to take. And I'm not sure it's actually balanced, even though the game came down to kind of like, ooh, we got to do stuff on the last turn to win the game. Yeah, but some of that is because the invasion came in on the last turn it possibly could, and a bunch of other stuff. Didn't feel like the Mexican invasion capability was ever really there. Again, maybe if the U.S. makes a big mistake, the game changes significantly. But I feel like it's the U.S.'s game to lose. They have to fail at something for that to happen. But anyway, the heart of the game is basically the movement and combat system. Hey, no shit. So those are based on this friction point idea, and you pay friction points for each connection that you move through, and you have a baseline friction point level, which is the troop quality. This is really a clever design idea. Instead of having, a separate morale, you have this, your friction points can't go below this. Because when you start looking at quality units, the big point with them is they can handle more stress than lower quality units can. And that's really how you express it. And if you put quality units through a long march or whatever, they're not really better, they're not distinguishable from lower quality units that were well rested. And so that kind of works nicely. The actual combat, though, is a little different. If you hold the field, your units get to sit there, they get to recover, and they get to attack the enemy after recovering when the enemy didn't get to recover. So what you have is kind of like a only one side gets to rest type of situation. Now, they may not be allowed to attack because they can't get their combat odds high enough because they were attacked, which means the enemy may have better odds than they do. It's not guaranteed because the U.S. has a bonus on attacking of 2 column shifts on the odds table. So they're able to make attacks at lower odds, and the Mexicans might be able to attack them back the next month, right? These aren't multi-day battles. And that actually leads to something that I was thinking that would enhance the story of the game, is break the battles out into something more exciting. I usually I'm not a big fan of let's make a little generic battle board and handle stuff on there. I'm not so much looking at that. I'm looking at something more like an Empires in Arms or EU style combat design. Now, of course, this would add a couple pages of rules, right? Probably. Where friction points are accumulated and reduced between rounds of combat. I'm not quite sure how to say that, but basically the idea is that you would have more than one battle in a month, or more than one day of battle in a month. And I think that's kind of a nice expression. Instead, what you get is a situation that's kind of like the good situation in Victory Games Civil War of, oh look, I smashed into somebody, we both got disrupted, nothing was gained, And now one of us gets not only the ability to recover, but the ability to strike. And in this case, it's always fixed. It's the guy who didn't take his move. It was the guy who was non-phasing. That happens in some results on the combat results table, not many. In particular, usually you drive the enemy from the field, either as the attacker or as the defender. Whoever wins the battle drives the enemy from the field and forces them to take some additional friction points. If you come up into a situation where combat, where you can't fight because you marched your men over the mountain and they all died, or they all got really, really tired, you just make it back to where you were and you don't actually attack and you don't install yourself in that position and you're not challenging the location any longer. But two sides can sit there, can have a bloody ass battle, and neither side is fatigued by the battle at all. The only way you get fatigued from a battle is when you're retreating from the field. And again, I feel like there's something that's just not quite right about that story. You know, in terms of the overall high-level abstract, I think it gives a reasonable enough situation. It's just, I feel like all this effort that I've put into the game in terms of, you know, keeping track of the units, their friction points and everything, ends up getting distilled too much by a combat system. Now, the combat system is a little cumbersome already, but it doesn't really tell much story. The cumbersome aspects of it are basically making some calculations and a bunch of die rolls. So here's the thing. Every time you move, you look at your friction points for every unit, basically, or every strength point that you have, and compare it and make a roll on here. And if you get one of these little red stars, ignoring this one, which is a misprint, if you get one of these red stars, that strength point is gone. Okay. It's an interesting way of expressing, you know, forces just not being able to hold together anymore under attrition. And there's abstraction in there, and that's fine, because some of the force may be included in another unit or something, maybe, whatever. Also, if you fight and you force the other guy from the field, they accumulate friction points from retreating, equal to the cost of the line that they ran across, plus an additional penalty, which is just added for retreating in most cases, and have to make that friction point disintegration check. But what never happens is there's never just a, hey, both sides take friction from fighting a battle, which makes sense, right? You know, normally that's what would actually happen. Instead, they've worked these exchange results in. 1/2 exchange and exchange results, and this kind of, hey, nothing really happened, you just sat there across from each other for a month. Both of those are unsatisfying to me. It feels to me like a better representation within what the game's concept is that you would accumulate friction points from battle. Now, who knows? Maybe this is what the additional development was, we want to get this game down to, you know, publishable size, and it's really looking like such a complex idea, let's boil it down more, and the development was really to make the game less interesting than it could have been. I'm not able to see with my crystal ball into the design and development decisions and where they went wrong. I just think that there is something here that's very interesting. So that's kind of the movement combat heart of the game, is that mechanism of the friction points. And again, it's not perfectly set up, and supply works into the friction points too, except small forces, which is basically anything not commanded by, you know, the two highest ranked generals on each side, are capable of not being in supply completely, which I don't really like. Living off the land should have a cost, and maybe not the same cost as it is for a huge army, but it does have some kind of cost, which should be represented somehow in friction points, I think, that you can immediately recover. I'm not going to talk too much about the little random chromey things, the invasion of Veracruz, where you get to make a roll and see when you get to do it, and you get to make decisions based on that. Polk's indecision, he drags his feet. But again, so all of the die rolls, except for the friction point table, all of the die rolls in the game are kind of based on the, well, if you roll a 1 or a 6, something special happens. Otherwise, you can pretty much predict it. And there's modifiers so that you can skew the rating a little bit. Something I didn't tell you about combat. So when you're in combat, I think I alluded to this. One of the things on this table is your combat class, and this is again. So you look at your friction points and you roll, and you see how good your forces are going to be in that particular battle, and it's a fairly tight range again. It looks like the biggest difference is 3 between 1 and 4. Generally, it's just 2. So again, it's a very smooth sort of situation, but you roll for each friction point level of unit. Now this is a place where I have a real disagreement. You're not rolling per strength point here, and boy, that would be obnoxious. But you're also not multiplying the strength points by the friction points that they accumulate. So having one really good quality unit, having one well-rested, good quality unit means a whole bunch of crap can be there and they kind of average out, depending on how you have things divided up. And it might make sense to walk a unit an extra couple of friction points to get a better chance on the table. I think you can kind of game the table that way. You can't game it by splitting up the units by saying, well, I've got 4 strength points of friction point 0 units. Let me split them into 4 different counters. That doesn't help you. But you could have a friction point 0 unit and do a couple of short little moves. Like you could run back and forth between these 2 locations and get yourself 6 extra friction points on a 0 friction point unit and be on not a bad table at all. That might help you in comparison to having all those same units just rolling on the 0 table, if you've got some higher friction point units in there. Casualties are assigned by the person taking them, so that's not too big a deal. You get to kind of decide what you want to do. There's a little bit of on a pursuit, whoever has the most cav inflicts a few, well, if you have the most cav and you win the battle and force the enemy to retreat, only retreat, you end up generating some additional friction points for them for each cav that you have access. Again, it's kind of I understand the why. It doesn't feel like it goes to enough detail. The next thing is the reinforcements, the victory conditions for the game, which each player starts with a morale level. The US's is very low. This forces them to do things. They have to capture Mexican territory to get their morale up. And in addition, they pay a penalty each turn that they don't capture a big enough location, sort of a city or something like that. They have to grab a location that's worth 10 morale points, or they lose 5 morale points in that turn, even if they captured a lot of other territory. The Mexicans have a fairly high morale point starting point, but they are pretty much just losing because each territory that's captured goes away from them. Now, it's possible, under the rules at least, for the Mexicans to capture territory in the U.S. It doesn't look very likely, but again, if the U.S. screws something up early in the game, or maybe gets terrible die rolls, although it doesn't feel like there's that much luck in the game, the Mexicans might be able to turn and make an advance into Texas or whatever, and gain themselves, some victory points. The game ends if somebody goes down to 0 victory points, morale points, whatever. The U.S. morale doesn't express the morale of the U.S. in entering this thing. I mean, they're probably not going to give up, but they may reduce their demands from, the fairly massive ones they inflicted to something much, much more moderate if you had if they end up not winning. There are also automatic victory conditions if Mexico City or New Orleans is taken. The game is just over. Now, if New Orleans is taken, the U.S. is probably like maybe has lost Texas or something there. That's going to be a pretty severe effect. But if the U.S. morale drops and some border areas were taken and there are problems, and they're just taking that 5-point penalty for too many turns or whatever, they may just decide, this war is no good. Okay, let's go to a status quo ante. But yeah, that's about it. And again, I don't think you want this game for any kind of like. I don't think it's particularly interesting as a competitive game. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of room for interesting choices happening in it. It doesn't tell quite an exciting enough story. But what it does do is it highlights this really innovative system that I feel like the failure of this game has buried. And there might be something that could be resurrected from this. There's a really cool idea here. But it would take a lot more development and maybe placement in a different situation. But definitely one where attrition is an important factor in the game. I think that's an important thing. And it's a concept which I think could apply to very, very different campaigns. So I don't know. It's a shame that such a cool idea, I think, was killed by this game. But there you have it. All right, let's send it up.